The sun was just beginning to rise over the streets of London, casting a golden glow on the iconic Buckingham Palace. The city was slowly waking up, with tourists snapping photos and locals rushing to work. Among them stood Private James Calloway, a member of the Royal Guard, dressed in his immaculate red tunic and bearskin hat. His posture was perfect, shoulders back, chin up, eyes forward. To anyone watching, he looked like a statue carved out of discipline itself. James had always been proud of his role as a Royal Guard. It wasn't just about wearing the uniform or standing tall. It was about representing something bigger than himself. But what many didn't know was that James carried more weight on his shoulders than most people realized. Born to a British mother and a Jamaican father, he'd grown up hearing whispers and facing stares because of his mixed heritage. Some told him he'd never fit into such a traditional institution, but James proved them wrong every single day by excelling in his duties. He believed deeply in the values of honor, respect, and service, and those beliefs kept him grounded even when others doubted him. On this particular morning, everything seemed peaceful at first. Tourists gathered around to take pictures of the guards, marveling at their stoic expressions and precise movements. Children giggled as they mimicked the guards' rigid stances, while parents reminded them not to get too close. James barely noticed the chatter. Years of training had taught him how to tune out distractions and focus solely on his responsibilities. Yet there was one voice that cut through the hum of the crowd, a sharp, unpleasant tone that made James's ears perk slightly. A man approached the perimeter where James stood guard. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with an air of arrogance that set him apart from the other pedestrians. This was Victor Langley, a man infamous in the neighborhood for his loud opinions and abrasive personality. Victor had a reputation for saying whatever came to mind, regardless of who might hear. Today, however, his words weren't directed at random strangers. They were aimed squarely at James. Victor stopped a few feet away, his Doberman trotting obediently beside him. The dog was sleek and muscular, its dark coat gleaming in the sunlight. At first glance, it seemed well-trained, but there was an intensity in its eyes that hinted at its potential for aggression. Victor smirked as he studied James, taking in the young guard's polished boots and neatly pressed uniform. Then, without warning, he spoke. "You don't look like you belong here," Victor said loudly enough for nearby tourists to hear. His tone dripped with mockery. "I mean, come on. What's next? Are we going to let just anyone wear that uniform?" James didn't flinch. He'd heard comments like this before, though usually behind closed doors or muttered under breaths. Still, hearing it so openly was jarring. He reminded himself of the rules. No reaction, no engagement. A royal guard was expected to remain neutral, no matter the provocation. So he kept his gaze fixed straight ahead, pretending not to notice the insult. But Victor wasn't satisfied with being ignored. He took a step closer, narrowing the gap between them. "Hey, I'm talking to you," he barked, pointing a finger at James. "Or maybe you're too busy pretending to be something you're not." The crowd began to shift uncomfortably. Some people exchanged glances, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. Others pulled out their phones, sensing that something unusual was about to unfold. Meanwhile, Victor's Doberman growled softly, its ears flattening against its head. It was clear that the animal sensed its owner's rising anger, and that things were about to escalate further. Victor's voice grew louder, cutting through the crisp morning air like a blade. His words were sharp and laced with venom, each sentence more biting than the last. "You think you're better than us," he sneered, his face twisted into a mask of disdain. "Standing there all high and mighty in that fancy uniform, acting like you own the place." He paused for dramatic effect, glancing around at the growing crowd as if seeking approval. When no one responded, his frustration boiled over. James remained still, his expression unchanged. Inside, however, his mind raced. Every instinct told him to defend himself, to stand up against the unfairness of the attack. But years of training held him in check. A royal guard wasn't just a soldier. He was a symbol of discipline and restraint. Reacting emotionally would only give Victor what he wanted, a reaction, a reason to escalate further. So James stood firm, his gaze fixed ahead, refusing to meet Victor's piercing stare. But Victor wasn't done. If anything, James's silence fueled his anger. "What's wrong?" Victor taunted, leaning closer. "Cat got your tongue? Or are you too scared to say something back?" He let out a harsh laugh, shaking his head. "Figures. People like you always hide behind rules and uniforms instead of facing reality." The comment stung, but James pushed it aside. Instead, he focused on controlling his breathing, keeping his body relaxed despite the tension building inside him. The tourists who had initially gathered to admire the guards now watched with uneasy expressions. Some whispered among themselves, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Others looked away, unsure whether they should intervene or simply leave. The atmosphere shifted from cheerful curiosity to palpable unease. Then came the moment everyone feared. Victor turned to his Doberman, gripping its leash tightly. The dog, already alert and agitated by its owner's mood, began pacing anxiously. Its low growl sent shivers down the spines of those nearby. Victor glanced at the animal, then back at James, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "Maybe I need to teach you some respect," he said, his tone dripping with malice. Before anyone could react, he unclipped the leash and gave the command, "Go." The Doberman sprang into action, lunging forward with terrifying speed. Its powerful legs propelled it toward James, teeth bared and eyes locked onto its target. Gasps erupted from the crowd as people scrambled backward, desperate to avoid getting caught in the chaos. Parents pulled their children close, shielding them from the scene unfolding before their eyes. For a brief moment, time seemed to freeze. James, however, didn't hesitate. His training kicked in instantly, overriding any trace of fear. In one fluid motion, he stepped sideways, creating distance between himself and the charging dog. His movements were precise, calculated, not an ounce of panic in sight. As the Doberman closed in, James raised his baton, using it not to strike, but to guide the animal safely away. With practiced skill, he positioned himself so that the dog couldn't reach him while ensuring it wouldn't harm itself either. For a split second, the crowd held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Would James retaliate? Would the dog turn aggressive again? But none of that occurred. Instead, James managed to gently pin the Doberman down using his baton, applying just enough pressure to immobilize it without causing injury. The entire process took mere seconds, yet it felt like an eternity to those watching. When the dust settled, the Doberman lay subdued, panting heavily but otherwise unharmed. James stood above it, his posture calm and composed, as though nothing out of the ordinary had happened. Meanwhile, Victor stared in disbelief, his smug grin replaced by a look of shock. He hadn't expected this outcome, certainly not such a measured and professional response. For the first time since the confrontation began, he faltered, unsure of how to proceed. The crowd, however, erupted into murmurs of admiration. "Did you see that?" One woman whispered to her companion. "He didn't even lose his cool." Another man nodded approvingly, adding, "That's real discipline right there." Even the tourists, who barely understood English, could sense the gravity of the moment. Cameras flashed, capturing every detail, as the incident transformed from a tense standoff into a testament to grace under pressure. Yet, despite the applause brewing in the background, James knew the ordeal wasn't over. Victor was still standing there, his face flushed with embarrassment and rage. And judging by the way he clenched his fists, it was clear he wasn't ready to back down just yet. As the Doberman lay subdued at his feet, James took a deep breath, steadying himself. His heart was pounding, but his exterior remained calm and collected. Years of rigorous training had prepared him for moments like this, not just physically, but mentally. He knew that reacting out of anger or frustration would only make things worse. Instead, he focused on de-escalating the situation, even as Victor's rage simmered dangerously close to boiling over. With slow, deliberate movements, James crouched down beside the dog, keeping his baton firmly in place to ensure it stayed under control. The animal's growls softened into low whimpers, its earlier aggression fading as it realized it couldn't break free. James spoke softly, his voice steady and reassuring. "Easy now," he murmured, not to Victor, but to the dog. "You're okay. Just stay calm." It was a small gesture, one that might have gone unnoticed by some, but it spoke volumes about James's character. Even in the heat of the moment, he showed compassion, not just to the people around him, but to the very creature that had been set against him. Victor, however, wasn't moved. In fact, seeing James handle the situation with such composure only seemed to infuriate him further. "What do you think you're doing?" he snapped, taking a step closer. His face was red, veins bulging in his neck as he pointed an accusing finger. "That's my dog. You've no right to touch him." His words were sharp, designed to provoke, but James didn't take the bait. Instead, he rose to his full height, meeting Victor's glare with a level gaze. "Sir," James said firmly, his tone respectful yet authoritative, "your dog is safe. Please restrain him." The simplicity of his response caught Victor off guard. There was no anger in James's voice, no hint of retaliation, just a quiet confidence that commanded respect. For a brief moment, Victor hesitated, his bravado wavering. But then he shook his head, dismissing James's calm demeanor as weakness. "Oh, don't give me that nonsense," Victor spat, crossing his arms. "You think you can play the victim here? I saw what you did. You attacked my dog." His voice carried across the square, drawing even more attention from the growing crowd. Tourists who had initially gathered to admire the royal guards now formed a loose circle around the scene, their phones raised to capture every detail. Some whispered among themselves, while others simply watched in stunned silence. James didn't rise to the accusation. Instead, he glanced briefly at the crowd before returning his focus to Victor. "Sir," he repeated, his voice unwavering, "I acted to protect myself and others. Your dog was aggressive, and I neutralized the threat without causing harm. Now, please secure your animal so we can resolve this peacefully." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. To anyone listening, it was clear that James was giving Victor a way out, a chance to walk away with his dignity intact. But Victor wasn't ready to back down. If anything, James's restraint made him angrier. How dare this man remain so composed when he, Victor, felt humiliated? It was as if James's calmness mocked him, highlighting his own lack of control. "You think you're clever, don't you?" Victor sneered, his voice rising again. "Standing there all high and mighty, acting like you're better than everyone else. Well, let me tell you something. Nobody likes a show-off." He jabbed his finger toward James, emphasizing each word. "And nobody likes someone who thinks they're above the rules." The comment drew murmurs from the crowd. While some nodded sympathetically, clearly siding with James, others exchanged uneasy glances, unsure how to respond. One elderly woman stepped forward, her cane tapping lightly against the pavement. "Excuse me, young man," she said, addressing Victor directly. Her voice was soft but firm, carrying the weight of someone who had lived long enough to recognize injustice when she saw it. "Perhaps you should consider your own behavior before criticizing others." Victor turned to her, his expression incredulous. "My behavior?" he echoed, throwing up his hands. "Lady, you weren't here when this guard attacked my dog. He had no right." But the woman didn't back down. "From where I'm standing," she replied evenly, "it looks like your dog was the one attacking first. And frankly, I don't see why anyone would unleash their pet on another human being unless they intended to cause trouble." Her words struck a nerve, not just with Victor, but with the rest of the crowd. A murmur of agreement rippled through the spectators, some nodding vigorously while others muttered under their breath. For the first time since the confrontation began, Victor found himself outnumbered, not just by James's poise, but by the collective disapproval of those around him. Still, he refused to concede. Clenching his fists, he shot one last glare at James. "This isn't over," he warned, his voice low and menacing. "Mark my words, you'll regret this." With that, he grabbed the leash and yanked the Doberman to its feet, dragging the bewildered animal away from the scene. As he stormed off, the crowd parted to let him pass, their eyes following his retreating figure with a mix of disdain and disbelief. James watched him go, his expression unreadable. Only when Victor disappeared from view did he allow himself a moment of reflection. His hands trembled slightly as the adrenaline began to fade, but he quickly steadied them, tucking them behind his back in the traditional stance of a royal guard. Despite everything that had happened, he knew his duty wasn't done. There would be questions to answer, reports to file, and consequences to face. But for now, he stood tall, embodying the values he had sworn to uphold: honor, discipline, and grace under pressure. As Victor disappeared into the distance, dragging his Doberman behind him, the crowd lingered for a moment longer, buzzing with reactions. Some people clapped softly, their applause directed not at James, but at the quiet strength he had shown in such a tense situation. Others shook their heads in disbelief, muttering about how unnecessary and ugly the confrontation had been. A few tourists approached James cautiously, unsure if they were allowed to speak to him while he was on duty, but eager to express their admiration nonetheless. "Excuse me, sir," one young woman said hesitantly, her accent betraying her American origins. She held up her phone, which displayed a video she'd recorded of the entire incident. "I just wanted to say, what you did back there was incredible. You stayed so calm when most people would have lost it. That's true bravery." James gave her a slight nod, careful not to break protocol by engaging too much. "Thank you, Mom," he replied politely, his voice measured. "I'm just doing my job." It was a simple response, yet it carried weight. To James, staying composed wasn't an act of heroism. It was part of who he was and what he believed in. But to the people around him, it was nothing short of extraordinary. The sentiment spread quickly among the onlookers. An older man stepped forward next, his weathered face lined with years of experience. "Son," he said gruffly, though his tone was kind, "you handled yourself with dignity today. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Men like that bloke." He gestured vaguely in the direction Victor had gone. "They thrive on chaos. But you rose above it." James nodded again, feeling a swell of gratitude despite himself. He wasn't used to being praised for simply following the rules, but today felt different. The crowd's support reminded him that he wasn't alone, that even in moments of conflict, there were always people willing to stand up for what was right. But not everyone in the crowd was focused solely on James. Several bystanders turned their attention to the footage they'd captured, realizing its potential significance. One man, a local named Thomas, stood near the edge of the group, scrolling through the video on his phone. His brow furrowed as he replayed the clip, zooming in on key moments. Victor unleashing his dog, the animal lunging toward James, and finally, James's calm and controlled response. "This is going to be important," Thomas muttered under his breath. He glanced around, spotting a couple of other witnesses who seemed equally concerned. "Hey," he called out, waving them over. "Did any of you get this on camera? We need to make sure we document everything properly." A teenage girl nodded eagerly, holding up her phone. "Yeah, I got all of it," she said, "even the part where that guy was shouting racist stuff before he set his dog loose." Her words drew murmurs of agreement from others nearby. Someone else chimed in, adding, "We should send this to the police or something. What he did wasn't okay. It was dangerous and completely unacceptable." The idea caught on quickly. Within minutes, a small group had formed, pooling their videos and discussing the best way to report the incident. They exchanged contact information, promising to stay in touch once authorities became involved. For many of them, it wasn't just about supporting James. It was about holding Victor accountable for his actions. After all, What he had done wasn't just an attack on one person, it was an assault on decency itself. Meanwhile, James remained at his post, resuming his stoic stance as though nothing unusual had happened. Inside, however, his mind raced. He knew that incidents like this rarely ended quietly. There would likely be investigations, statements, and possibly even media attention. While he didn't relish the thought of being thrust into the spotlight, he also understood the importance of transparency. If sharing his story could help shed light on issues like racism and public safety, then he was willing to endure whatever came next. As the crowd began to disperse, a few stragglers lingered, reluctant to leave the scene entirely. One elderly woman approached James one last time, her eyes filled with warmth and admiration. "Young man," she said gently, "don't let this shake your faith in humanity. Yes, there are bad apples like that fellow, but look around you. Look at how many people stood by you today. That says more about our world than anything else." Her words struck a chord deep within James. For all the challenges he faced because of his heritage, moments like this reminded him why he chose this path in the first place. Being a royal guard wasn't just about protecting traditions or standing tall in a uniform. It was about inspiring others to believe in fairness, respect, and unity. And today, surrounded by strangers who had rallied to his defense, James felt a renewed sense of purpose. It didn't take long for the authorities to arrive. The sound of approaching sirens cut through the quiet hum of the morning, drawing curious glances from tourists and locals alike. Two police officers stepped out of their car, their expressions serious as they surveyed the scene. One of them carried a notepad, while the other held a tablet, ready to document everything. They moved with purpose, clearly aware that this wasn't just another routine call. James remained at his post, but he knew his involvement in the investigation was inevitable. As the officers approached, one of them gestured for him to step aside momentarily. "Private Calloway?" the officer asked, his tone respectful yet firm. James nodded, stepping away from his position just enough to speak without abandoning his duty entirely. "We need to get your account of what happened here," the officer continued. "Can you walk us through it?" James recounted the events calmly, sticking to the facts. He described Victor's aggressive behavior, the racist remarks, and the moment when the Doberman was unleashed. His voice never wavered, even when recounting the most tense moments. The officers listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes or asking clarifying questions. When James mentioned how he had subdued the dog without harming it, one of the officers raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed. "That took some skill," he remarked. "Not everyone would have kept their cool like that." While James spoke with the officers, the crowd that had gathered earlier began to thin out, though not entirely. Several witnesses stayed behind, eager to share their perspectives. Thomas, the local who had taken charge of collecting footage, stepped forward first. He handed over his phone, which contained multiple angles of the incident captured by different bystanders. "Here," he said firmly, "this should give you a clear picture of what went down. That man, Victor, he was out of line. You can hear him shouting those hateful things loud and clear." The officers reviewed the videos carefully, their expressions growing increasingly somber as they watched. One clip in particular stood out. It showed Victor smirking as he unclipped the leash, then giving the command for his dog to attack. Another video captured the aftermath, with James calmly restraining the animal while Victor ranted and accused him of wrongdoing. The evidence was damning, leaving little room for doubt about who was at fault. Other witnesses chimed in, each adding pieces to the puzzle. The elderly woman who had defended James earlier spoke passionately, her voice steady despite her age. "I've lived in this neighborhood for decades," she told the officers, "and I've seen my share of troublemakers. But what that man did today, it was deliberate. He wanted to provoke a reaction, and when he didn't get one, he tried to twist the story to make himself look like the victim. It's disgraceful." Even the teenage girl who had recorded the incident offered her input, her youthful enthusiasm tempered by seriousness. "I heard him say all those awful things before he let the dog go," she explained. "He was trying to intimidate Private Calloway because of who he is. It wasn't just about the dog. It was about sending a message." As the testimonies piled up, it became clear that public opinion was firmly on James's side. The officers exchanged meaningful looks, silently acknowledging the weight of the evidence against Victor. One of them turned to James and said, "Thank you for your cooperation, Private. Based on what we've seen and heard so far, it seems like you acted appropriately under very difficult circumstances. We'll be following up with the individual involved, and we'll keep you updated on any developments." James nodded gratefully, relieved that the immediate ordeal was coming to an end. But as the officers packed up their equipment and prepared to leave, he couldn't help but notice the lingering tension in the air. While justice might eventually prevail, the emotional toll of the confrontation lingered, not just for him, but for everyone who had witnessed it. Later that afternoon, news of the incident began to spread beyond the square. Social media played a significant role, with videos and photos circulating rapidly. Comments poured in from people across the city, and even around the world, praising James's composure and condemning Victor's actions. Some posts highlighted the broader issue of racism, using the incident as a rallying cry for change. Others focused on the importance of respecting authority figures like the Royal Guards, emphasizing that they deserved admiration rather than hostility. For James, the sudden attention was both heartening and overwhelming. Strangers stopped by throughout the day to offer words of encouragement, some leaving small tokens of appreciation near his post. A handwritten note, a cup of coffee, or a flower. Each gesture reminded him that he wasn't alone, that there were countless people who believed in fairness and equality. But amidst the outpouring of support, James also felt a deep sense of responsibility. He realized that his actions, or rather, his restraint, had sparked a conversation that extended far beyond this single incident. People were talking about racism, accountability, and the power of grace under pressure. And while he hadn't sought to become a symbol of resilience, he understood that sometimes standing firm in the face of adversity could inspire others to do the same. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across Buckingham Palace, James resumed his position, his posture as impeccable as ever. The day had been long and challenging, but it had also reaffirmed his belief in the values he held dear. No matter what challenges lay ahead, he knew one thing for certain. He would continue to stand tall, not just for himself, but for everyone who believed in a better, kinder world. The investigation into the incident moved quickly, thanks in large part to the overwhelming evidence collected by witnesses. The police reviewed hours of footage, piecing together a clear timeline of events that left little room for interpretation. Victor's actions, his racist remarks, his deliberate unleashing of the Doberman, and his attempts to shift blame onto James were all captured on camera. Even his license plate number, recorded by one vigilant bystander, helped authorities track him down without delay. When the police finally arrived at Victor's home later that evening, he was unprepared for the gravity of the situation. At first, he tried to play the victim, insisting that James had overreacted and accusing the officers of bias. "You're only here because of him," Victor snapped, pointing angrily toward an imaginary version of James in his mind. "He's the one who provoked my dog. I didn't do anything wrong." But his protests fell flat when the officers showed him the videos. Seeing himself on screen, his sneering face, his cruel words, the moment he set his dog loose, left him momentarily speechless. The officers wasted no time laying out the charges against him. First, there was the matter of allowing his dog to behave dangerously in public, which violated animal control laws. Then came the more serious accusations, inciting racial hatred and disorderly conduct. Each charge carried significant penalties, but it was the combination of them that painted Victor as someone who had crossed multiple lines. When the officers informed him that he'd need to accompany them to the station for further questioning, Victor's bravado crumbled. For the first time, he looked genuinely rattled. Meanwhile, back at Buckingham Palace, James received updates from his superiors about how the case was progressing. While he appreciated being kept in the loop, he couldn't help but feel conflicted. On one hand, he was relieved that justice was being served. On the other, he disliked the idea of anyone's life being upended, even someone like Victor. It wasn't in James's nature to hold grudges or seek revenge. Instead, he hoped that the consequences Victor faced would serve as a wake-up call, a chance for reflection and growth rather than punishment alone. Word of Victor's arrest spread quickly through the neighborhood, sparking mixed reactions. Some residents felt vindicated, believing that he had finally gotten what he deserved. Others expressed concern, not necessarily defending his actions but questioning whether the legal system would address the root causes of his behavior. One neighbor, an elderly man named Harold, summed it up best during a casual conversation with a friend. "Victor's always been trouble," Harold admitted, shaking his head. "But locking him up won't fix whatever's eating away at him. He needs help, not just handcuffs." As news outlets picked up the story, public interest reached new heights. Headlines blared phrases like, "Royal Guard shows remarkable restraint," and "Man faces charges after racist outburst." Social media buzzed with debates about accountability, racism, and the role of law enforcement in addressing such incidents. Many praised James as a hero, while others used the opportunity to highlight systemic issues that went far beyond this single confrontation. Through it all, James remained focused on his duties, refusing to let the attention distract him from his responsibilities. In the days that followed, James received formal commendations from senior officers within the Royal Guard. His commanding officer personally thanked him for upholding the values of discipline and integrity under extraordinarily challenging circumstances. "What you did out there wasn't easy," the officer said during a brief ceremony. "But you reminded everyone watching exactly what it means to be a guardian, not just of tradition, but of humanity itself." While James accepted the praise humbly, he knew that true recognition came not from medals or certificates, but from the impact his actions had on others. Letters of gratitude began arriving at the palace, sent by people inspired by his composure and resilience. Some were written by parents teaching their children about courage and empathy, while others came from individuals who had faced similar discrimination and found solace in knowing they weren't alone. Yet, amidst the accolades, James stayed grounded. He understood that moments like these, while significant, were fleeting. Life would soon return to its usual rhythm, with tourists snapping photos and guards standing tall in their iconic uniforms. But something inside him had shifted. The incident had reinforced his belief in the power of grace under pressure, a lesson he vowed to carry with him every day, both in and out of uniform. For Victor, however, the road ahead was less certain. As he sat in a holding cell, awaiting, Victor's court appearance came weeks later, and it was a day filled with tension. The courtroom was packed, not just with lawyers, police officers, and reporters, but also with members of the public who wanted to see how justice would be served. Some had come out of curiosity, others out of solidarity with James, and a few simply because they were eager to witness accountability for someone whose actions had caused such outrage. When Victor entered the room, his demeanor was markedly different from the arrogant man who had confronted James outside Buckingham Palace. Gone was the sneer, replaced by an uneasy frown. His shoulders slumped as he took his seat, avoiding eye contact with anyone in the room. It was clear that the weight of the charges, and the public scrutiny, had taken its toll on him. Yet, despite his apparent discomfort, he still clung to fragments of defiance, muttering under his breath about exaggerated accusations and media sensationalism. The prosecution presented their case methodically, laying out every detail of the incident. They played video clips showing Victor unleashing his dog, shouting racist remarks, and attempting to intimidate James. Witnesses testified, recounting what they had seen and heard that morning. Thomas, the local who had gathered footage, explained how multiple angles confirmed Victor's deliberate provocation. Even the teenage girl who had recorded the event spoke confidently, her voice steady as she described hearing Victor's hateful words before he set his dog loose. James himself was called to testify. Dressed in civilian clothes instead of his uniform, he walked into the courtroom with quiet dignity. When asked to recount the events, he did so calmly, sticking to the facts without embellishment. He didn't portray himself as a victim or paint Victor as a villain. Instead, he simply described what had happened, letting the evidence speak for itself. His composure left a lasting impression on everyone present, including the judge, who nodded thoughtfully as James spoke. For his part, Victor struggled during cross-examination. His attempts to downplay his behavior fell flat when faced with irrefutable proof. At one point, his lawyer tried to argue that the confrontation had been a misunderstanding, claiming that Victor hadn't intended to incite racial hatred. But the prosecutor quickly dismantled this defense, pointing to the explicit language captured on video. "Does this sound like a misunderstanding?" the prosecutor asked rhetorically, playing a clip where Victor's derogatory comments were loud and clear. The courtroom fell silent, the gravity of the moment hanging heavily in the air. By the time closing arguments began, it was evident that the verdict would not go in Victor's favor. Still, the judge emphasized the importance of fairness, reminding everyone that the legal process existed to ensure justice, not vengeance. In the end, Victor was found guilty on all counts, allowing his dog to behave dangerously in public, inciting racial hatred, and disorderly conduct. The sentence included fines, mandatory anger management counseling, and community service focused on promoting tolerance and understanding. As Victor stood to hear his punishment, his face flushed with shame. For the first time, he seemed truly remorseful, or at least aware of the damage his actions had caused. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed him, asking for comments. Initially, he refused to speak, keeping his head bowed as he pushed past them. But then, hesitantly, he stopped and turned back. I made a mistake," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I let my anger get the better of me, and I hurt people, not just physically, but emotionally. I'm sorry." It wasn't much, but it was a start. The apology, though late and reluctant, signaled a glimmer of change. Over the following months, Victor began attending counseling sessions as part of his sentencing. At first he resisted, dismissing the exercises and discussions as pointless. But slowly, through conversations with his therapist and interactions with diverse groups during his community service, he started to confront the prejudices he had harbored for so long. It wasn't easy. There were moments of frustration and denial. But he persisted, driven by a newfound desire to understand rather than judge. Back at Buckingham Palace, life returned to its usual rhythm for James. Tourists continued to admire the guards, children mimicked their rigid stances, and the world kept spinning as it always did. Yet, James carried something new within him, a deeper appreciation for the ripple effects of grace under pressure. His restraint hadn't just diffused a dangerous situation, it had sparked conversations, inspired strangers, and even prompted reflection in someone as unlikely as Victor. One afternoon, while standing at his post, James noticed a familiar figure approaching. It was Harold, the elderly neighbor who had once commented on Victor's need for help. Harold smiled warmly, tipping his hat in greeting. "Just wanted to say thank you," he said softly. "You handled everything with such dignity. And look, maybe your actions reached farther than you thought." He gestured toward a nearby park, where Victor could be seen volunteering as part of his community service, helping organize a cultural festival aimed at fostering unity. James followed Harold's gaze, watching silently as Victor interacted awkwardly but earnestly with attendees. There was no guarantee that Victor's transformation would stick, but for now, it was enough to know that progress was possible, even in the unlikeliest of places. As Harold walked away, James resumed his stance, his expression calm yet resolute. He knew that true courage wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic victories. It was about choosing kindness over bitterness, patience over retaliation, and hope over despair. And in doing so, he had reminded everyone, including himself, that even in the face of hatred, humanity could shine through. Months passed, and the incident outside Buckingham Palace became more than just a memory. It became a story that people told to remind themselves of the power of grace under pressure. James continued his duties as a royal guard, standing tall and unwavering in his iconic uniform. To the tourists who snapped photos and the locals who walked by, he was a symbol of tradition, discipline, and strength. But to those who knew the full story, he represented something deeper: resilience, compassion, and the quiet courage it takes to rise above hatred. The ripple effects of that day stretched far beyond the square where it had unfolded. Social media posts about James's actions inspired countless discussions about racism, accountability, and the importance of treating others with respect. Teachers used his story in classrooms to teach students about empathy and leadership. Parents shared it with their children as an example of how to handle conflict without resorting to anger or violence. Even news outlets revisited the incident periodically, highlighting its enduring impact on both individuals and communities. For James, life returned to its steady rhythm, but he carried the lessons of that day with him everywhere he went. He often reflected on how quickly things could have spiraled out of control if he hadn't relied on his training and values. It wasn't just about subduing a dog or ignoring insults. It was about choosing to act with integrity when it mattered most. That choice had resonated deeply with others, proving that even small acts of courage could spark meaningful change. Victor, too, underwent a transformation, slow and imperfect, but undeniable. His mandatory counseling sessions forced him to confront the roots of his anger and prejudice. At first, he resisted, dismissing the exercises as pointless. But over time, he began to see patterns in his behavior that he hadn't noticed before. He realized how much of his bitterness stemmed from fear: fear of change, fear of difference, fear of losing control. Through conversations with his therapist and interactions with diverse groups during his community service, Victor started to let go of some of that fear. It wasn't easy. There were days when old habits crept back in, and moments when he doubted whether he could truly change. But he kept trying, driven by a growing desire to be better, not just for himself, but for those around him. One of the most surprising developments came when Victor volunteered at a local youth center as part of his community service. Initially hesitant, he found himself drawn to the energy and optimism of the young people he worked with. They challenged him to think differently, asking tough questions and sharing their own experiences with discrimination and adversity. Slowly, Victor began to open up, admitting his past mistakes and expressing his hope to do better. The kids responded with surprising kindness, offering encouragement rather than judgment. For the first time in years, Victor felt like he belonged somewhere, a feeling he hadn't realized he'd been missing. Meanwhile, James's reputation continued to grow, though not in the way one might expect. He didn't seek fame or recognition, yet his name became synonymous with dignity and grace. People stopped him on the street to thank him, not just for what he had done that day, but for the example he set every day since. Strangers sent letters praising his character, while colleagues within the Royal Guard looked up to him as a role model. Yet despite all the attention, James remained humble, always deflecting praise onto the values he believed in rather than his personal achievements. As time went on, the two men's paths crossed once more, not in confrontation, but in reflection. During a community event aimed at promoting unity, Victor spotted James standing nearby, chatting with attendees. Hesitant but determined, he approached the guard, extending a hand. "Private Calloway," he said quietly, his voice tinged with emotion, "I owe you an apology. What I did that day, it was wrong. I can't take it back, but I want you to know I'm working on being a better person." James studied him for a moment, then accepted the handshake. "Thank you," he replied simply, his tone measured but sincere. "That's all any of us can do, try to be better." The exchange was brief, but it carried immense weight. For Victor, it was a step toward redemption. For James, it was a reminder that everyone deserves a chance to change. In the end, the legacy of that fateful morning wasn't defined by anger or division. It was shaped by the choices made in its aftermath. James's restraint had shown the world that true strength lies in rising above hatred, while Victor's journey demonstrated that growth is possible, even in the face of deep-seated flaws. Together, they reminded everyone who heard their story that humanity is capable of extraordinary things when we choose compassion.